Good morning, everybody. It is Monday morning Talmud here at Congregation Beth Shalom in beautiful Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where it is drizzling. It is supposed to drizzle all day long. The high is supposed to be 79. The Pittsburgh Pirates are still buried in the bottom of the NL Central. And we have a full complement of students today, including two here in the Lehman Center. You're all welcome to come for morning minyan, coffee, and Talmud. There were three different kinds of fish out today. It's very exciting. We're going to continue. We're picking up with a Mishnah, which should be really good. If you're scoring at home in Safaria, I will share this with you in a second. We're on Rosh Hashanah 32b.18, okay? And that is, we're picking up with a Mishnah that number of people immediately tickled their fancy, and hopefully all of you will find this to be really interesting. This one is going to be, remember, for those of you who have been with us for the last couple of weeks, which is everyone but our new friend, David, is your name? Larry. Larry is visiting from Columbus, Ohio. Say hi, Larry.
Hi, Larry.
Hi,
Larry.
Hi, Larry.
So for everyone but Larry, we've been doing this tractate of Talmud for 4 years now. And now into year 4, we are steaming towards the conclusion. What we were immediately doing before this was discussing what are the verses that are allowed to or not allowed to be said for the mussaf of Rosh Hashanah. So we'll pick it up with the Mishnah. I will share a screen with Yins, and we will go from there. Now, do not look down upon Larry because he is from Ohio, because Larry is actually a native Pittsburgher. And to prove that point, he is wearing his Steelers jersey today, even though the Steelers are not currently playing football. I'm going to zoom this screen a little bit, make it a little bit bigger. All right, we're going to pick it up with the Mishnah. I will do the Hebrew. Elisheva Yuval of Carmel Yisrael, you will do the English. It is all right with you. Matnitin, ha'over lifnei hateva, b'yom tov shel Rosh Hashanah, hasheni matkia, uvishat ha'Hallel, harishon makre et ha'Hallel.
Mishnah. With regard to one who is passing before the ark as prayer leader on the festival of Rosh Hashanah, it is the second prayer leader, that is, the one who leads the additional prayer, who sounds the shofar on behalf of the congregation. And on a day when the Hallel is recited, the first prayer leader, that is, the one who leads the morning prayer, recites the Hallel on behalf of the congregation.
Okay, so a quick editing or clarification. So in the bold lines, of course, that is the words of the Talmud itself. And in the unbolded lines, that is the words of the editor in order to make it all seem nice and clean. And our editor, of course, is Adin Steinsaltz and his merry band of misfits in the land of Israel. One might make an argument in the middle line where it says it is the second prayer leader, i.e. the one who leads the additional prayer. That is, as I looked it up, of course, according to Rashi, okay? So if we were to ignore that and we were just to go back, there are potentially either 2 or 3 characters in our story, okay? Either there is 2 characters, and those 2 characters are known as the Rishon and the Sheni, and one of those people is also known as Ha'over Lifnei Hateva, right? So we're talking about the first person and the second person, and one of those persons is referred to as the person who passes before the ark, which is usually known as the sheliach tzibbur, the person leading services. However, there is another way to read this, which is to say there are 3 people, right? There is the over lifnei hateva, meaning the prayer leader. There is a second person, which we're calling the sheni, and there's a third person, i.e., which we're calling the rishon, the first person, right? Which would mean that there's a person who leads services, there's a person who leads the second part of the services, and there's a person who blows the shofar. Now, Rashi doesn't read it that way. The Rashi understands basically that you're in a small town or in a small synagogue, and you got a cantor and a rabbi, right? not that small a synagogue, right? A small enough synagogue that you only have two leaders. And the question is basically, if one of you is doing shacharit and one of you is doing mussaf, who blows the shofar? And the answer that is given here by Rashi is basically to say the second prayer leader who does mussaf will be the one who blows the shofar, right? So basically, it's very interesting. It's very circumscribed, right? Guy gets up, he does birkot shachar. I do mean guy in this case because we're talking about ancient Israel. But if we were living in the modern era, a human being gets up, does birkot shachar, psukei zimra, the shacharit service, and then when it's time to do shofar, you bring somebody else up to blow the shofar, right? And that person, according to this, should be the person who does mussaf. The other way to read this potentially is to ignore that the word second is synonymous with the person who leads mussaf. You're literally just saying the person who does shacharit should not also be the person who blows shofar, right? I actually think that makes perfect logical sense, but we generally follow Rashi because we're terrified of 11th century medieval French people. Okay, Renee, go ahead.
What's the explanation of the last part that it says, and on a day when the Hallel is recited, the first prayer leader recites the Hallel on behalf of the congregation? Could that be considered a third person also?
Yeah, so I think so. But again, I think Rashi's understanding this because I think Rashi's understanding is really logical. And it's related to a thing that conservative rabbis do all the time, but shouldn't, according to the Talmud. A person who leads services is really supposed to just mumble the Hebrew. In a traditional conservative synagogue, and one of the things that I have found ridiculous throughout my career, the cantor or the sheliach tzibbur says all the Hebrew, and the rabbi's job is to get up every 5 pages from his or her august chair upon the bima, walk over to the microphone and say, "We're on page 234." and sit back down again. And by the way, when I took on the job as associate rabbi here at Beth Shalom, Rabbi Adelson said to me, like, "Are you going to be in the sanctuary next Saturday when I'm away?" And I said, "I can be. What do you need me to do?" And he said, "Nothing really. Sheldon will call pages." And I was like, okay, well, but if Sheldon's doing the page calling job, then what does the rabbi do? And the answer is absolutely nothing, because the rabbi's job, if they're not giving the sermon and they're not giving the teaching and they're not giving the bar mitzvah charge or the bat mitzvah charge, and they're not doing a baby naming or an ufraf, is to call out, "We're on page 243. And that's it. That's the rabbi's job. The reason for that, by the way, this is my long-winded way of saying, what's the reason for that? The reason is that the sheliach tzibbur should not interrupt their prayers to say anything other than the words in the Hebrew. Now, there are some specific places where it's really, really extra bad to interrupt, but generally, they're really supposed to not do that. Why am I giving you this long-winded explanation? Because that's what's going on here logically, which is that we don't want the sheliach tzibbur to also interrupt their prayers by jumping in and doing something like shofar, or jumping in and doing something like Hallel. So the Talmud here is prescribing which person is kind of on deck to lead services and which person is leading, at what points they should switch off and why. So that's the long-winded, semi-nonsensical answer to you, Renee, which is the rabbis are really trying to create a strict structure about who should say Hallel in the event that you have 2 shlichei tzibur. And they're basically saying, well, the shacharit should do it, not mussaf. Another way of understanding that is kind of understanding if the service had a halftime show, right? If it was like a football game, right? And at some point the band comes on, or the cheerleaders shoot T-shirts into the stands. The question that we're asking in the Talmud is, where is halftime on Rosh Hashanah? And the answer that the Talmud effectively starts to give is it's either at the shofar blowing and then the shofar blowing, it's the beginning of the shofar blowing, and the first part is shacharit. And then because mussaf is doing the shofar blowing, those are appended to one another. But if there is Hallel on Rosh Hashanah, and that should set off alarm bells for a lot of you, right?
There's not.
Then it is, but the interesting thing is they're saying it like it is, right? They say it plain as day, right? As if there is Hallel on Rosh Hashanah, the first prayer leader does it, which means it implies very strongly that, like, right, when we do Hallel at the end of shacharit, right? But before we get to the Torah service, that you would append the Hallel to the end of shacharit, and the sheliach tzibbur, the over lifnei hateva, is the person who is shacharit. So there, if this Mishnah is to be understood as when is halftime on Rosh Hashanah, the answer is it depends whether we're saying Hallel or not. And then everyone objection in this room is, but there is no Hallel on Rosh Hashanah. And that's the funny thing, is that the rabbis say it in the Mishnah, they say it authoritatively. Like, well, of course, on a day when it's Hallel, right? Which is super weird, right? Because Hallel, right? Like in 365-day year, Hallel falls on Rosh Chodesh. But Rosh Hashanah is always Rosh Chodesh. It's the first day of Tishrei. So what the hell is going on here? All right, Marian, go ahead, and then Elisheva.
Yeah, I was just curious about the phrase "Over lifnei hateva," passing before the ark. That is a very interesting, strange way of putting it. And is there an explanation for it?
So the explanation is backwards in the sense that, like, we use the phrase sheliach tzibbur. My recollection Talmudically is that over lifnei hateva is the dominant phrase. Why we don't use that phrase anymore, I don't know. Like, overwhelmingly, the phrase over lifnei hateva shows up over and over again in the Mishnah. I don't remember. I know that I'm almost certain that sheliach tzibbur shows up in the Talmud, but my brain tells me that over lifnei hateva is more common. It is common enough, by the way, that Steinsaltz makes no mention of it whatsoever. He has no note of it. And when Steinsaltz makes no note of it, that means it's not really that interesting to him. It's not rare enough to warrant mention. And it's very literal. It's the person who stands in front of the ark. Now, remember, in a Ashkenazi synagogue, the bima is right in front of the ark, and in a Sephardic synagogue, it's in the middle, and there's rows of seats usually in between. So it's even more complicated because they're not exactly over lifnei hateva; they're kind of in the middle of the room in a Sephardic synagogue. So. Maybe that answers a little bit of what the setup might have looked like in Mishnaic times. Okay, Elisheva, go ahead.
I just, knowing that there's no Hallel on Rosh Hashanah, which is my favorite trivia question, I just read it as meaning, well, on those other days when Hallel is read, this is who does it. Not indicating or suggesting that there is ever Hallel on Rosh Hashanah. Was there at one point?
This would imply very strongly that there was. But the weird thing is that the Talmud doesn't go down this rabbit hole at all. It just moves on very quickly. So, and there are also, I don't think any notes in the comments from Steinsaltz that would explain why there would be any possibility of doing Hallel on there. Now, so Larry asked, why would there be Hallel on Rosh Hashanah? The answer is very logical, which is there's Hallel every Rosh Chodesh. Why wouldn't, I would say the other way, Larry, why wouldn't there be Hallel on Rosh Hashanah, since it is also Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, right? We also don't announce the new month, as far as I recall.
Right,
we don't say Rosh Chodesh Tishrei Yihiyeh, right? We don't do that the week before either. So that's, yeah. All right, Rav Judy.
All in service of confusing the acher.
So that's for what I just said, but we have yet to get our answer for why there is no Hallel on here. So Stay in suspense for like 3 more lines and we'll get there. Judy, did you want to ask a question or make a comment?
Well, yeah, they could just be talking. It isn't necessarily that there was Hallel previously, or going back 1,000 or 1,500 years or whatever, 2,000 years, that there was actually Hallel on Rosh Hashanah. They're talking about who will do the extra thing. So the one who's leading the service doesn't sound the shofar. On the other hand, when Hallel is recited, is Hallel before mussaf?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes,
so
right after the Amidah and shacharit.
Mussaf. So the first prayer leader does that too.
Right.
So it doesn't necessarily have any one thing could. This is just an example of this,
Yeah.
and then this is an
Yeah.
example of that.
Yep. This,
That's how I took it
Yeah,
also.
I'm not swearing to that. I'm just saying that's just as logical as that at one time there was Hallel.
yeah, this is basically my understanding of this Mishnah. If we were to boil it down really simply, is at what point does Elanit come up to Rabbi Goodman and say, Rabbi Goodman, you get the hook. It's my turn to lead services now. That's the question that's before us. And the reason that is because Hallel and shofar effectively jump into the same slot, which is they jump into a slot that is appended to the Torah reading, right? They're attached to that Torah reading. And the Torah reading is also the breakup point between shacharit and mussaf. So that's kind of our understanding of what's doing here. But the interesting thing is, I said it like that's the logical basic understanding of what this mission is doing here. It's when does the sheliach, when do you call in the relief pitcher for the sheliach tzibbur? And what the Gemara is going to do to this is completely ignore that and dive in really to the problem of the first part and then the problem of the second part. The problem of the first part being this question of like what Rishon and Sheni means, and then to the problem of the second part being what the hell are we doing talking about Hallel on Rosh Hashanah? All right, with that, we have beaten this Mishnah to pieces. Let's keep going. Marion, will you do me the favor of reading this in the English? Gemara. So the rabbis of the Amoraic period who begin around the year 200 and continue to, according to many authorities, 476, according to scholars, into the 500s. My shana sheni matkia mishum de berov am hadrat melech. I hachi halel nami nema be sheni mishum de berov am hadrat melech.
Gemara. The Gemara asks, what is different about the second prayer leader that he sounds the shofar during the additional prayer? Is it due to the principle that the splendor of the king is in the multitude of the people? In other words, is the shofar sounded during the additional prayer because all of the congregants will have arrived by then? If so, with regard to Hallel too, let us say that it should be read by the second prayer leader due to the principle that the splendor of the king is in the multitude of the people.
Okay, so there's an interesting statement being made here, which I think I understand what it means. So they're using a verse, and the verse, the way they understand it, is funny, right? The verse that they pull from Proverbs is Derov am hadrat melech. In the multitude of the people is the glory of the king, right? And I translated that literally because the translation, the splendor of the king is in the multitude of the people, inverts the Hebrew, right? Derov am, in the majority of the people or in a large group of people, hadrat melech literally translates as is the glory of the king. So what does that verse mean in this sentence? And the answer is, for those of us who go to Shabbat morning services on a regular basis, we absolutely understand what this means, which is, and Rabbi Adelson is funny, we're both back in the building after both being on vacation for 2 weeks. He knows this very well because he actually instituted a change to morning services here at Beth Shalom based on this principle. Ain't nobody in the building at 9:30, right? When I start doing Birkot Shachar at 9:30, if I'm here for shacharit, or if Yolanit's here for shacharit, there's a decent chance that we've just barely scraped 10 people, right? We may have to like hook Robert in from his office to make sure we get 10 people, not only on Shabbat, but of course on weekdays too, that like, people kind of stumble into Minyan when they want to. And on Shabbat, we get more people coming in at 10 and 10:30 and 11. And my wife, who rolls in just in time for the Amidah, the Aleinu, because she knows when Kiddush starts, right? Like people show up later. So what does that mean here? The implication here is that the mussaf davener, the person who leads for mussaf, has a nicer voice. Why? Because there's more people there, right? You put your best davener up for mussaf because the crowds will be there, because there ain't no early risers. That's the implication of the phrase derov am hadrat melech, right? And then so when the Gemara answers what is different about the second prayer leader, that he sounds the shofar during the additional prayer, due to the principle the splendor of the king is the multitude of people. The implication being that the shofar goes to the second prayer leader because they are maybe the higher quality person. The other possibility is that this is, and I don't really feel compelled by this argument, but that we're starting to make some sort of statement about where the shofar service goes. Although that doesn't really make sense here because they're not really talking about where the shofar goes in the order of things. But we are still thinking about overall the principle of what parts of the service go where based on how many people are present for them.
Isn't it interesting that 2,000 years ago, people came late to services too?
Yeah. D said, isn't it interesting that people came to services late a long time ago too? And the answer is yes. It seems like that is the case. But just to finish the thought before Judy, you go, they make the same argument with Hallel, right? Which is like, oh, if so, then Hallel should also be done by the mussaf person, since if the mussaf person is a better davener, they should also do Hallel because Hallel's awesome, right? Which is a really interesting statement. All right, Rav Judy, go ahead.
Great minds think alike. I was just thinking the same thing. Isn't that fun? It's funny that back in the day, people started to drift in at mussaf.
Yeah.
I think that great minds think alike.
Yeah. I mean, I think the interesting thing is here is that they're not really focused on the fact that like nobody wants to miss the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. But their implication here is that the shofar blower, the person who leads mussaf is also going to be a good shofar blower, which I find very interesting. Marian's shaking her head too and saying like, I don't understand the logic behind that either. I'm not entirely sure why they think that.
Not necessarily.
We have a totally different person blowing the shofar.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a legitimate point. Now, the codes, the halacha drops it like this. And I don't know if this is going to be helpful, but I'm going to read it out loud and translate it. Regarding the phrase hasheni makia, the second blows, ikar hatkiya hi b'tkiyat me'umad, right? The main thing about blowing the shofar is that the blowing of the shofar takes place while standing. Al seder habrachot, in alongside the order of the blessings. The omer b'mishnah tiknu otan b'tfilat hamusafim, and therefore, according to the Mishnah, it should be affixed to one who does the mussaf. That didn't really do much for me, but it's a note. It's a note that's here. They go on, but I don't think they really kind of answer so much, except to kind of argue this backwards and forwards in a way that doesn't ultimately end in a place. Judy, did you want to say something else?
No, I thought I lowered my hand.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
You're good. All right. Noreen, why don't you read line 20 for us in the Hebrew? I will do the English. They're going to kind of invert the logic a little bit and play with it. Ela my shana halal de barishon mishum de zrizin makdimin lemitzvot tikia nami naaved barishon mishum de zrizin matkia makdimin lemitzvot.
Rather, what is different about Hallel, as is recited by the first prayer leader, it is due to the principle that the vigilant are early in the performance of mitzvot. This is also difficult with regard to the sounding of the shofar too. Let us perform it by means of the first prayer leader, due to the principle that the vigilant are early in the performance of mitzvot.
Okay, great. So they're doing a really interesting thing here. The principles that they're juxtaposing off of each other are derov am hadrat melech, right? That's principle one, that's a verse from Proverbs, but the way we're literally translate or figuratively translating that idea is you should do the good parts of the service when most of the people are there, right? That's how we're understanding a line from Proverbs. The other one is the principle of you should be zriz for mitzvot. And the principle of being zriz for mitzvot is the principle by which why we put on our talit and why we put on our tefillin first thing in the morning. So the principle there is I love to be zriz for mitzvot is to say, I love to do the mitzvot. I'm zealous for them. I love them. I'm excited. The word here they use is vigilant, but I think zriz is better translated as like zealous. And the understanding that they have is if you really love your talis and your tefillin, you're going to want to put them on first thing bang in the morning. It's also the reason why we have services early in the day, as opposed to like having been a religion that carved out a work time lunch break at 10:45 every day for tefillah. You should be zriz to do tefillah. You should be excited to get up and do tefillah. You should get out of bed, shave, shower, comb your hair, and get to synagogue so that you can say your prayers, because nothing is more exciting than saying morning prayers, right?
And then you can leave early.
Yeah, right. The problem with that, of course, is it is an exact contradiction of the idea of doing stuff when everybody's there, right? So if you were to say shofar is a thing we should do because we are zriz lemitzvot, you should do it when you get to services on Rosh Hashanah morning at 8:30 in the morning. The problem with that, as we've already enunciated, is ain't nobody want to be at services at 8:30 in the morning. They want to roll in at 11 o'clock, right? And so it is a direct contradiction to derov am hadrat melech. So that is a problem, right? The principle, the vigilant are early in the performance of mitzvot. The reason I say that is because you could make that argument with Hallel and shofar, but we don't really do that. Now, Hallel is appended to the shofar, Hallel is appended to the shacharit service, and shofar is appended to the mussaf service, logically, at least in terms of who does it. But the logic by which they append them is based on whether it's better to be early because you're excited about the mitzvah or late because you have a better sheliach tzibbur, right? The logic that they've applied here is that's dumb. You should want to be zriz for the mitzvah for shofar just as much as you should want to be derov hadrat melech for Hallel. So what really just happened, I think, you could argue this point if you really wanted to get into the weeds, is the logic has completely canceled itself out, and we've been left in a place where nothing that I've just said actually holds water. You could probably continue to make this argument, but it would probably be wasted breath. This is the kind of thing that if we were in Vilna in the 18th century, we would spend the rest of the day on. No joke. That's what's called pilpul, of trying to pull out the logic of this little section of Talmud into 4,000 different strands. I would bet that the Rosh, the Rif, the Ran, and the Shitumeku Betset spend a week on this. But I am not the Rosh, the Rif, the Ran, or the Shitumeku Betset. Go ahead, Elisheva.
I a little simpleton. It occurs to me that the mitzvah of shofar is different from the others in that the mitzvah is to hear it. So if you blow it when nobody is there, you have not allowed anybody to fulfill the mitzvah. So it makes sense for the shofar to come later when people are there, because the mitzvah is to hear it.
Right. Very good. We are going to go on a little bit and see more about Hallel. I have a note here from, I think, from one of my teachers from when I took this as a class a number of years ago, that notes that Rosh Chodesh Hallel is only a minhag. And the question, there is a question halachically as to whether Hallel for Rosh Chodesh is supposed to be recited with a bracha or not. Now, I just have that a note in the side of my Gemara. The last time I studied this tractate of Talmud with a Talmud teacher was at Pardes in 2004 or 2003. So this is a really long time ago. It's like, that's a note that's 20 years old, and I have no recollection of ever writing it down. So it may have occurred as a fever dream, but nonetheless, it kind of gets at that point of like, when and why do we say these things? So here, these 6 words are going to be the authoritative conclusion to this idea. So with the exciting conclusion, I will give it to Renee. Renee, you're going to read this huge section of English, which is based on only 6 words in the Hebrew. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Bishat Hashmad Shanu.
Rabbi Yochanan said, they taught the halacha that the shofar is sounded during the additional prayer in a time of religious persecution. The Gentile authorities prohibited the sounding of shofar and appointed guards during the morning to ensure that the Jews comply. Therefore, the sages delayed the sounding of the shofar until after the guards had left. A similar degree was not imposed against the recitation of Hallel, and therefore it was recited during the morning prayer at the earliest possible time.
Great. Again, everything other than the bolded lines is Steinsaltz according to Rashi. So this is our authoritative opinion, which is why is, and it does 2 things, right? The first thing it does is it tells us that this is the winning argument, that the winning argument is the mussaf person is the shofar blower, or parenthetically, that the shofar blowing occurs during mussaf, which also implies potentially that the shofar blowing as we know it, right, a shofar service that occurs right around the time of the Torah service, right before the Torah service, was not done in what is referred to here as Shat Hashmad, the time of persecution. Rashi's note is that the Gentile authorities prohibited the sounding of shofar and appointed guards during the morning. Tosafot, if you look in Tosafot, they have a note on this, which is kind of, Tosafot's hard to understand, but Steinsaltz has a note that helps explain it in my book, which is to say that, because if you're wondering, like, why would shofar blowing be a problem for the non-Jews? The answer is that if you blew shofar early in the morning, the shofar is a thing that, according to the Torah and according to kind of contemporary times in the Babylonian, the Geonic, and even really into the medieval period, a shofar sounds like a war trumpet. And the fear, according to Tosafot, was that if the Jews are blowing their shofar at 8:30 in the morning, or whenever, to be zriz for the mitzvah, or maybe at 9 or 10, if it's in order to do it at the time of the shofar service, like the way we do it now, it would very strongly imply to all of the nobles of the county, gather your horses and gather your field soldiers, for we are joining together at the county square to revolt against the evil bishop, right? Or to go to war against the neighboring non-Jewish county, right? That is the understanding of Tosafot. And it does make some sense, because we know that shofars and trumpets are used, they were used up until the Civil War in the United States for battle, right? They rally the troops, and a different bugle call tells people whether to fall forward or fall back, or where to rally or whatever, right? You use a shofar for war. And so in times where the Jews were in a position where they might rebel against the authorities, the shofar was taken away from them, or they were told by their own authorities, don't blow the shofar. The non-Jews will come and kill us because they think we're revolting, right? So it's very logical and very interesting. The implication, last thing I'll say before I'll answer any questions, is the implication here is also that they therefore moved the shofar service all the way into the mussaf, because the mussaf service, as you know, from Rosh Hashanah, doesn't really happen until, like, if you're really moving fast, 11:30 in the morning, 12:30, right? And at that point, the non-Jewish authorities, they're like, the Jews aren't going to like rally at the middle of the day to go to war. Everybody knows that you've got to rally your troops at the break of dawn, right? The other way of understanding it is that, and this is one that is related to something in Brachot, and that's probably why Rashi understands it this way. For those of you who are early risers to morning minyan on a weekday, and you come to any conservative or Orthodox synagogue, you'll note that there's a Shema early in the service. And the reason for that was that there was a point apparently in medieval Europe where the medieval authorities declared, we're going to destroy Judaism by banning the prayer that's most important to them. So we'll ban Shema Yisrael, right? And the non-Jewish authorities, according to Rashi, knew that Shema Yisrael usually hit around 30, 45 minutes into the service. So they would send their guards to synagogue, and, you would post your synagogue time at we're going to start at 9:00. And they would send the guards to go and make sure the Jews weren't reciting Shema, and the guard wouldn't get there till 9:15 or 9:30. So what did the smart rabbi do? The rabbi told the entire congregation, listen, we're going to say Shema at 9, okay? And then when they come at 9:30 and the Goyim want us to not say Shema, we'll get to the part of the Shema and we'll skip it. And the Goyim will say, they skipped Shema like we told them to. But they won't know that we actually said Shema at 9:05, right? This thing is almost identical to that, which is the Goyim come. I'm using Goyim in a semi-pejorative term because we're talking about naughty Goyim in the medieval period. I like non-Jews. I have love for my fellow human beings, as my Hasidic class students will tell you about on Wednesdays, right? I have infinite love for them. We're using the pejorative concept of Goyim here because we're talking about naughty Goyim who oppress our Jews in times of Shmad, right? So this is a similar idea, which is that the naughty Goyim who come and try and oppress us by making sure we don't blow shofar, the king tells them, right, from 9 to noon, the Jews are going to try and blow the shofar. Don't let them. But at noon, when your shift's over, you can go home because everybody knows the Jews don't blow the shofar later in the day. And when the guards go away, the implication here from Rashi is the Jews will go, ha, 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 now we can blow shofar, right? I don't know if I buy that, but that's literally what Rashi says here. And by the way, I don't know if I buy the thing about that Shema either, but literally that's what Rashi says. All right, Elisheva, go ahead.
Did they really think we were that stupid that we couldn't find a way around it?
I don't know. It's a great question, but it's the point I think still stands, which is they made it hard for us, and they found ways of making it hard for us, and we found ways around it, which I think is actually possible, right? But I don't know. It is a good question of how much of this is this weird ex post facto logic that they came up with. All right, Judy, go ahead, and then Olivia.
All right, so Rabbi Yochanan lived when? Much earlier than Rashi. Rashi was 11th century, right? Yochanan was when? 200 of the Common Era?
Earlier, Rabbi Yochanan is the rabbi who we understood was snuck out of Jerusalem during the Great Revolt.
All right, okay.
So
so we're talking about the Romans, not the Christians. The Christians for sure wanted to destroy Judaism, and that's a smart thing. Don't let them say the Shema. But we're talking about much earlier. We're talking about Roman persecution.
Right. Rashi.
That's important.
Yeah. The other important thing is, and I think thank you for pausing there, Judy, because that really helps. I think we are understanding something really important, which is Rabbi Yochanan lived in a time of religious persecution and could make law based on oppression and suffering, and starts to understand. And he's really one of the key figures in Jewish history who reflects that the tradition has to be changed in the post-Roman era and the post-destruction era, because life has changed. So that's very well said. Thank you. Olivia, go ahead.
How do you know that's Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and not Rabbi Yochanan, the Chavruta of Reish Lakish? I would think it would be the latter one because it's in Amar and we're in the Gemara.
Oh my God, you're right. You're right. Good job. That is probably right. So that would be, if it's Yochanan and Resh Lakish, then they're a matched pair and they're early, very early Amoraim. They're like first generation Amoraim, putting them at
Not
like.
that they're not.
So that would be, they were persecuted by the
Still the
in
Romans.
Middle East.
No, they'd still be
Still
Roman. It'd still be Roman persecution.
Still Roman, right, still Roman, sorry.
Just
Okay.
a different like
A different Roman.
on Ben
era.
Zakkai like saw the
Yeah.
destruction of Jerusalem before his eyes, and this would be a couple hundred years of like living under oppression. And
Right,
what I raised my hand for was that I once heard that we started doing a haftarah because during the times of oppression from like the Hanukkah story, we were told we weren't allowed to study Torah. And so we said, haha, we're going to study the prophets. And I thought that was a really fun story. And then I'm like, how would an oppressive force like be like, oh, you got us. I guess you're allowed and we're going to let you do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I do have a lot of problems with those stories. Your thread is right on, Olivia, which is the strange explanations that the Jewish people have given liturgically for additions and subtractions based on oppression all seem unlikely to me. And considering how our liturgy has actually evolved, which is we keep adding stuff because we want to add it for some reason, or because some rabbi wrote a piyut, or it got moved around because, like, for instance, the thing that I was mentioning before, there is a thing at the very beginning of services where we study a piece of text and then we say Kaddish to Rabbanan. Rabbi Adelson thought a couple of years ago here at Beth Shalom, before my time here, that was a great opportunity to teach rabbinic text. But if we're going to do it at 9:35, nobody's here. Why don't we drop it in the order and put it right before the Torah service? So here at Beth Shalom, it happens at about 10:15, and that's my job now, hopefully. Or we're going to split it for much of the next year. But the idea is, you know, cool rabbinic teaching and an opportunity to educate the congregation should be here, Barov Hadrat Melech, right? When everybody's here. The last one I was going to mention that's related to this liturgical editorially weirdness is there's one other really famous one, which is there is a line in the Aleinu, Shehem Mishtachavim Lehevel Barek, right? Right, which is this line that was originally in the Aleinu prayer. The Aleinu prayer is a early prayer that was part of the High Holiday liturgy and then got added to all liturgy because people really liked it. But it used to have a line in there that said, for they bow to emptiness and meaninglessness and they call out to a God who will not answer them, right? Or who will not save them. And according to tradition, that was read by non-Jewish censors in the medieval period as a polemic against Christianity specifically. And the bishops and the Christian censors said, you know, you may not say this anymore. This is inflammatory and incendiary. And so the Jews took it out. And then much later, some synagogues in the Orthodox community have put it back in, but the vast majority in all of the major branches of Judaism, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, Reform, Conservative, and Renewal, have not put it back in. That story, as far as I know, is absolutely true because I've read it in multiple academic books that I was forced to read in rabbinical school. Okay.
With
And I
names
do mean
of the
forced to read
person.
because all the liturgy books in rabbinical school, as I believe I have mentioned in this class before, are boring as snail snot. Okay, go ahead, Elisheva.
It also in the reports of it, the name of the guy who was an apostate and told on us is always recorded, which also
Nice.
makes you think it's more accurate. Once I read that, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, and I've been saying that line ever since, not because I think it refers to Christians, but because we have so many opportunities for idolatry in our lives. Money comes particularly to mind that for me, I find it a helpful thing to say. So people sometimes kind of look at me askance when they hear me say it. But I think it's an important thing to say and to bring back for modern purposes. And my Orthodox friends have told me it is back in most of the Orthodox prayer books, at least here. I don't know about in the States. The Art Scroll has it in parentheses.
Right. So great. Yeah, I think most of the conservative and the reform world didn't put it back in because you could read it offensively, which is like to say we're better than them.
You can also read it very helpfully for the conditions of today's life.
Right. And I think knowing the history of that line in prayer is really valuable because I think also remembering that Jews have been oppressed, and to our point that this whole topic that like non-Jews editing our liturgy and looking at our liturgy and saying, you can say that, you can't say that, is a really valuable, right? There's 2 points here that I want to make that are great for us on a broader context. One is censorship sucks and you shouldn't do it, right? You shouldn't censor what other people say. And the second piece that's related is anti-Semitism is real and we shouldn't pretend like it doesn't exist, right? Now, Elisheva's point is this line reminds me of both those things. And my point is, yes, this line reminds me of both those things, but I don't need it in order to remember those facts because I know the whole story, right? Okay, for that, we're gonna do one more line. Ilanit, a while ago, about 30 minutes ago in the chat, you wrote, this is my favorite thing. And I now have no idea what your favorite thing is. So if you're not folding your laundry, you can tell us what your favorite thing is.
Oh, it was just when we were reading what the idea that, like, you know, in Talmudic times, people were still kind of wandering in whenever they wanted.
Gotcha. Cool. Marion, I'll answer your question. Then we're going to do this one little section really quickly. And then just as our leave it up to next week starting point. Go ahead, Marion. Oh, you muted yourself. There you go.
I was just going to say, this obviously indicates that these oppressors, if you will, they knew the prayer book. They knew the prayers of the Jews.
Right.
So I think it's an interesting point.
That is. So this relates to a thing that
there were Jews who became traitors. That's what I would call.
That's
possible. What happened to
Pablo Christiani among them.
Right. That's possible. But it is also possible that that is all bull. And the reason I say that is because the Talmud has an imagination of oppression or an imagination of non-Jews' fascination with Jews that may not necessarily be so. Why do I say that? The Talmud has a number of stories in which a Jew and a Gentile, particularly the Roman Caesar is usually, or a Roman general, have a debate. And in the Talmud, the way the story is told repeatedly, there are many examples of this. The two of them are quoting Torah to each other, right? As if Julius Caesar has a complete photographic memory of all of Tanakh and can quote chapter and verse back and forth with the Jews. By the way, there are similar stories in the Midrash and in the Talmud with characters like Balaam, right? That Balaam and other people are quoting chapter and verse backwards and forwards each other. In the Talmud's imagination, we are the center of the universe. Everything revolves around us. And so in that logic, of course, the non-Jews are reading through all of our prayer books and picking out the lines that they either find most offensive or the lines that they find will mess with our religion. Because of course, the non-Jews know that Shema Yisrael is the most important prayer in the world. So therefore, they would require us to no longer say it at the normal place in the service. I want you to stop for a second and think about that and wander the streets of Pittsburgh or wander the streets of New York or Los Angeles or Chicago or Miami and see if you walk up to 100 people and you say, are you Jewish? And if they say no, you say, can you tell me what is the most important prayer of the Jewish people? And they'll say, heck if I know, man, right? Like they don't know. These people don't know. They don't know anything about us. And if you went up to, by the way, if you sat down with a bishop or the archbishop of the diocese of Pittsburgh, right? I bet you he wouldn't know either, right? Like, so I am just, I'm not saying this authoritatively. I'm not saying there's no way all of this editing of our prayer book took place. I'm just saying we Jews are certain that non-Jews are fascinated with us, right? Whereas the reality might be, we may not actually be the centers of the universe that we think we are. All right, Judy, go ahead.
Respectfully disagree. It isn't a question that they think we're the center of the universe. It's a question of those in power feeling that the Jews are a loose cannon and they don't conform and we're going to control them.
Right.
So it isn't the man in the street today. It wasn't the man in the street then. It was these powers that be, just like who is funding the Oath Keepers and that other group? Who paid for their hotel rooms at the Willard Hotel, if that's where they stayed?
Mhm.
That's pretty. Who paid for their uniforms? There were people behind it. I'm not being paranoid. There are very, very wealthy people behind those groups. They may not have formed them, but they're supporting them. And that has not come out yet. So to say this is all right, imagination of Caesar, etc.,
Yeah.
debating Talmud, yes, but that they felt that they had to pick and choose when they were going to say certain prayers, yes. And
Right.
let's not delude ourselves that this was not true.
Right.
I think
Right.
that
The parallel that I could
totally
make,
wrong.
yeah, the parallel I could make
Totally
to
wrong.
the parallel I could make to Judy's point is if we were writing Talmud today in America right now, off of the last Supreme Court session, we could write a little page about how there was a case of a coach who made a Christian prayer at halftime of a football game, and the Jewish kids, had to be included in it. And 1,000 years from now, someone could be reading this and be like, is that really a thing? Would a Christian football coach even bother to say a prayer at a football game? And why would that be a big deal for a legal case? And the answer is, it is a big deal, and it does matter.
Sure
All right.
is.
We're going to read this one thing. I'm going to read this one thing to us just to leave you all, because it's a good concluding piece, and then we'll call it a day. I won't explain it. I'll just leave it as it is. Mid kamar bishat Hallel miklal de Rosh Hashanah leka Hallel. My taima amar Rabbi Abahu amru malache hasharit lifnei hakadosh baruch hu Ribono shel olam mipmei ma ein Yisrael omrim shira lefanecha beRosh Hashanah uba Yom HaKippurim amar lahem efshar melech yoshev al kisei din v'sifrei chayim v'sifrei metim petuchim lefanav v'Yisrael omrim shira. The Gemara comments, from the fact that the Mishnah states when Hallel is recited, one can conclude by inference that on Rosh Hashanah there is no recitation of Hallel. What is the reason that Hallel is omitted on Rosh Hashanah? Rabbi Abahu said, the ministering angels said before the Holy One, blessed be God, Master of the universe, for what reason don't the Jewish people recite songs of praise, Hallel, before you on Rosh Hashanah on Yom Kippur? He said to them, Is it possible that while the king is sitting on the throne of judgment and the books of life and the books of death are open before God, the Jewish people are reciting joyous songs of praise? Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are somber days of judgment whose mood is incompatible with the recitation of Hallel. So that's our authoritative position. We're going to kind of toss that around from a theological perspective next week. I will see you all back here. I hope you're all good. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us for Talmud this morning.